What do you find at the end of a rope somebody strung across the ice 70 winters ago? Rena Ostmark was 24 the January her uncle put her out of the trading post at Fort Vermilion with a leather rope tender's kit that had been her father's $37 in a Chase and Sanborn coffee tin and a small terrier named Skip that had grown up under the counter. She was walking north because a freight sled had gone missing on the Peace River ice in 1889, and she had reason to think she could still find the guideline her grandfather had strung to lead it. The town said 70 winters was too many. The rope had another opinion. What the ice had held that long she meant to be first to touch. If a story about a person who kept walking north when a whole town told her not to has ever felt close to yours, take a second to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It helps us find the folks who need these stories most. She was born in the fall of 1937, in the top room over the Ostmark trading post at Fort Vermilion, on a night the aurora ran so low a person could hear it. Her mother, Marie-Louise Bergeron of Gruar, was French métis and the school teacher for that district for 11 years. Her father, Ivar Ostmark, was a line tender for the winter freight road that ran north from Fort Vermilion, up the Peace to Fort Chipewyan, and in some years, past it. Line tenders were the men who kept the marker poles standing on the winter road and who strung and maintained the guide ropes on the whiteout stretches, so a freighter driving blind in a Chinook could keep his sled on the ice by grip alone. It was a trade that had gone into and out of favor with every generation. Her father was of the last generation that made a living at it. She learned rope. That was the first thing. She learned it before she learned the alphabet. Her father tied every knot the trade used on a length of yellow hemp at the kitchen table and made her tie it back until she could do it in the dark. Sheet bend, rolling hitch, timber hitch, marling spike hitch. The line tenders owned two-loop bowline which held a marker pole against the pull of both directions, and the family knot. Every line tender carried a signature, a small variant in a common bend that any other tender could read as identification, the way a rider read a brand. The Ostmark variant was a sheet bend tied over a small preliminary half-hitch made in the loose end before the tuck. It looked, to the untrained eye, like a sloppy sheet bend. To another tender, it was a signature the length of a name. Her grandfather Ulf had used it. Her father used it. She learned to tie it before she was 7. The one detail that would matter later, that would foreshadow the whole thing, was this. Her father took her out on a blizzard morning when she was 8 and set her hand on the guideline at the north edge of the trading post yard. He told her the marker pole at the end was 90 feet away, and she was to walk to it with her eyes shut, hand on the rope. She walked. She reached the pole. He was grinning under his beard when she came back. He said, "The rope is honest when nothing else is. Learn to trust it. It will save your life 2 or 3 times before you understand what it did." She would remember that in the past. She would remember it after. Her mother died of consumption in the wet spring of 1949. It was quick, 6 weeks, and it was quiet. Marie-Louise had been school teacher long enough to have taught most of Fort Vermilion to read, and half of Fort Vermilion came to the funeral. Rena was 11. She wept once, at the graveside, and then she did not weep in front of her father again, because she saw what it cost him each time. She took over the mending and half the cooking. She learned the words for her father's grief in French and did not use them in English. Her mother had called her Mop-Tight, my little one, and after the funeral, Mrs. Colville from 3 doors down brought a stew and used the same word, and Rena almost broke, but did not. She sat and ate. She would carry that word around like a pebble in a shoe for years. Her father died at 49, of a heart that had been giving him warnings for 2 seasons and finally took him coming off a whiteout run. She was 19. He came in the door coughing, sat down on the boot bench, said, "Mop tight, I did not tie the last one right," and slipped sideways. She caught him. She could not hold him. He was buried beside her mother. She kept the rope kit and the family knot. Her father had left his fur territory, 150 square mile trap line east of the Peace, a line his own father had held before him, to be shared between Rena and his older brother Peter. Peter ran the trading post at Fort Vermilion since Ivar had gone into line tending. Peter was a quiet, sour man with pale eyes, who had never quite forgiven his younger brother for marrying a Métis woman. For 18 months after the funeral, Peter was correct with Rena. He gave her a room over the post. He fed her. He put her to work at the counter and paid her in trade credit at the store. He did not, in the 18 months, once mention the trap line. Then Peter married. Her name was Bernice, and she was from Grande Prairie, and she was 38 and had 2 grown boys of her own, one of whom needed a start, and she moved into the top room of the trading post and made it clear, without ever raising her voice, that Rena was in the way. Bernice was not cruel in an obvious sense. She was cruel in the quiet way that only a woman who has come late to a house can be. 20 small refusals a day, the washing up, the order in which the boots went by the door, the word "mop tight," which Bernice used once at supper, in French, in a tone that made it a mockery, and then never used again. In the 2nd month of the marriage, Peter called Rena down to the front room and set a paper on the counter and said the fur territory had been signed over to him by Ivar the week before Ivar died. He said Ivar had known his heart was failing and had wanted the line kept together and had put it in Peter's name for safekeeping. He said, in a voice with no give in it, that this was the way it was, and that if Rena had ever thought there was a share for her, she had been mistaken. He said her father had loved her and had not thought she was a fur woman. He said she was welcome to stay on at the post until the ice broke up, and after that he would prefer she moved on to Peace River Town or Grande Prairie, where she might find a husband suited to her. She looked at the paper. It was in her father's hand. She knew her father's hand as she knew her own. She also knew the date. Her father had been in the 2nd week of the illness that killed him on the date shown. He had been unable, on the date shown, to hold a spoon steady. The signature was his. Peter had not forged it, but the paper it was on was fresh, and the date was a lie, and Peter had steadied the pen. She said none of this out loud. She said, "I will be gone by the new year." Peter nodded and looked away and did not ask her what she meant to do. She left on the 2nd morning of January, the coldest day of that winter, with the temperature at 40 below and a wind out of the northwest and the light so low the sun was only a red place on the horizon. She had packed the rope kit, which was a folded leather roll that held a fid of walrus ivory, a palm and needle, a spool of waxed thread, a splicing hook, a coil of new yellow hemp, a small awl for pole work, and her father's log book with the old routes marked in it. She had packed the Chase and Sanborn coffee tin with $37 in it and a lock of her mother's hair pressed inside the lid. She had packed a wool coat, 3 pairs of moccasins, 2 pairs of duffel socks, a knife, matches in 2 tins, a small pot tea, pemmican, and the terrier Skip, who was 10 and had never known any other roof than the trading post counter. She walked north. She walked to Fort Chipewyan because that was where Klaus Ekberg lived, and Klaus Ekberg was the man her father had named to her, once, as the man he would send her to if it ever came to that. Her father had said the name only once, at supper, 5 years before he died, in a sentence that had not been about her at all. He had said, "Klaus Ekberg has seen every rope on this river." She had held that name like a keepsake ever since. The winter road followed the peace ice, from Fort Vermilion to Peace Point, and then west to Fort Chipewyan on Lake Athabasca. In good years, it was 8 days on foot. In a January with a wind out of the northwest, it could be 12. She made it in 11. She slept in 3 overhang cabins along the way, small, unheated shelters left for freighters, and, once, in a stand of black spruce with the dog against her back and a fire the size of her hand between her boots. She did not stop moving in the day. Skip trotted beside her, tail down, and did not complain. He was a terrier of the small mixed kind that trading posts always had, with a wiry black coat and a white blaze and eyes the color of a wet stone, and he was the only living thing in the world that morning that she owned. She fed him first at every stop. Klaus Ekberg's cabin was on the east side of Fort Chipewyan, back a quarter-mile from the shore. He was 68 when she found him. He was a big Swede, whose hair had gone white early, and whose hands had swollen at the knuckles from 40 winters of rope work in the cold. He looked at her a long moment at his door and said, "You are Ivar Ostmark's girl." She nodded. He said, "Come in. The dog, too." He set a plate for both of them. He asked after her farcolor. She told him. He nodded once and did not speak of it further. She stayed with Klaus for 3 weeks. She told him on the 3rd night why she had come. She had come to look for the Duffy sled. "Ferris Duffy," she said. The freight master who had gone out onto the ice from Peace Point in the January of 1889, with a specie box for the Hudson's Bay factor at Fort Chipewyan and 4 dogs, and a young swingman named Osric Vale, and had not come out. Her grandfather Ulf Ostmark had strung the guideline for that run. Her grandfather had been the last man to see the sled leave. She wanted to walk out and find the sled. She thought the rope was still in place under the ice. Klaus looked at her a long time. He said at last, "Ice does remember. Ropes remember longer. I looked once myself in 1920. I did not find it." She said, "You were not an Ostmark. The rope will read." Klaus almost smiled. He said, "That is the trade talk. It is not wrong." He said, "I will show you what I know." He showed her. He showed her the pressure ridges of Lake Athabasca, and how a rope frozen down in the anaerobic layer under new ice preserves better than a rope on the surface, because oxygen does not reach it. He showed her the frost blooms that form above a buried marker pole in a certain kind of cold snap, because the pole conducts warmth from the earth even 70 winters after it has fallen. He showed her the way to test hoarfrost with the back of a knife blade to feel for the small metallic knock that meant iron beneath. A horseshoe from a freight team, a buckle from harness, a wrought nail from a sled runner. He showed her how to walk the ice with her feet a little wider than usual, so a sudden hollow would not put both feet through at once. He showed her, above all, the family knot. He tied it himself. His signature was different, a rolling hitch tied over a stopper, and he tied it beside her deep bend with preliminary and said, "There, now I know it as if I had tied it. Go find yours." Fort Chipewyan is a small town, and word travels. By the end of her 2nd week there, most of it knew what she meant to do. The HBC factor's grandson, Baird McQuine, who ran the store his family had run for 3 generations, laughed at her once over the counter and said the Duffy sled was a story mothers told bad children when they wanted them to come in from the ice. The postmistress, Lucy Colville, was gentler and told Rena over tea that most of the men who had gone out looking for that sled had come back with frostbite and no sled to show for it, and would she not consider staying at Fort Chipewyan and taking the school teacher's post that was going open. Rena thanked her and said no. Bernice's letter arrived at the post on Rena's 3rd week in Peter's hand. Peter writing on behalf of Bernice, saying the rope kit had been Ivar's property, and property was a legal thing, and would Rena return it. Rena read the letter and burned it in Klaus's stove. Klaus watched her do it and did not say anything, but he put another log on after the letter was ash. She left Fort Chipewyan the last week of February. Klaus walked with her the first 3 miles out onto the ice and stopped at the last low ridge and said, "Nies, you go. I stay here. If you find the rope, come tell me." He called her Mutnies, not Muptite. She noted it. Munies meant he had adopted her, in some way, on the way through Fort Chipewyan, and she had not quite noticed. She hugged him. She walked east. If you are new here, and this is finding you at a hard patch, know that we do this every week, and every subscription helps the next person find these stories. Thanks for being here. She walked east across Lake Athabasca with Skip, and a small hand sled she pulled behind her, carrying pemmican, a shovel, an ice axe, an auger, a length of the yellow hemp, and the rope kit against her chest under her parka. She walked with her palm turned outward and down, feeling the low air for the small breath drift that came off a buried pole, and she stopped at every hummock and knelt and set the back of her knife on the hoarfrost. On the second day, she found the first pole. It was a spruce trunk, about 10 feet long, wintered black, standing at a slight lean out of the ice like a fence post. She marked it. She walked on. 200 yards further, another. 200 yards on, another. She was reading her grandfather's line. It ran, as her grandfather's log said it had run. From a landing at Peace Point, northwest across the lake, to a place the freighters had called the Elbow, where the wind broke off Poplar Point and made a permanent pressure ridge. It ran, as the log had said, on a diagonal that a modern skidoo trail would have laughed at. The old freighters had chosen their lines by wind, not distance. The straightest line was, in a January blow, the deadest line. Her grandfather's diagonal cut inside the pressure fields. On the fourth day, 5 miles into the Elbow, in air that had gone still enough to hear the ice complain to itself, she came to a place where the marker poles stopped. She stood in the stillness and looked. The line of poles she had been following ran west, then bent, then simply ended in a low ice hummock, the shape of a half-buried whale. The hummock was not natural. Its shape was too regular. Its hoarfrost was heavier at the two ends and lighter across the top. Under the back of her knife blade, the hoarfrost gave the metallic knock. Not once, repeatedly, along a straight line 6 feet long. She had found the Duffy sled. She sat down beside it. She said aloud, in the still cold, "There you are, Mr. Duffy." Skip put his head against her thigh. She stayed still a long time. Then she took out the ice axe and began. She worked slow. Winter ice does not forgive haste. She cut a shallow trench along the top of the hummock, 6 feet by 2, to expose the sled deck without shattering what was under it. The ice under the hoarfrost was old and clear and hard, and the axe rang on it like a bell. It took her the whole of one day to make the first cut and expose the top of the tarp. The tarp was frozen into the ice as if it had been laminated in. She had to shave with her knife, in thin curls, to get it clear. Under the tarp, the sled bed. Oak planks, dark, splintered where the cold had worked at them. The tarp had held the shape of what was beneath as if the sled had been embalmed. She could feel, through her mittens, the outline of 2 long shapes running the length of the sled, and, between them, a squarish block that could only be a strongbox. The 2 long shapes were men. She had known that from the shape of the tarp before she cut it, because the shape of a tarp over a man is the shape of a man, and no fresh snow will hide it. She left them under the tarp for now. She did not lift what could wait. There would be time. The strongbox she cleared. She worked all of the second day at it. The lid was corroded to red flakes, but the box under the flakes was sound. It was cast iron, hinged on the long side, with a hasp and a padlock the color of old blood. She could not lift the lid. The tarp had frozen down at the hinges. She cut, with her fid and her knife, at the frozen leather straps that held the tarp to the box. The fid was walrus ivory, her father's, and it did not much like the cold, but it did what she asked. When the box was clear of the tarp, she looked at the padlock. She took the fid, wedge end in, and set it against the shackle. She struck the blunt end with a flat stone she had picked up on the fourth day. The shackle rang. It did not give. She struck it again. Rang. Did not give. She struck it a third time and it broke, a clean break, and the two halves of the lock fell into her mitten. She lifted the lid cold. Then dark canvas, then gold. She sat back on her heels. She did not touch the coins. She counted with her eyes, then stopped counting. Gold nuggets, not coin. Each nugget the size of her thumbnail or larger. The canvas bag they had lain in had rotted through, and they had spilled against each other in the box. A specie box that had, in 1889, held its weight in raw claim gold from a small stake up the Slave River, on its way to a bank in Winnipeg, through the Fort Chipewyan factor. She would learn the whole route later. She would learn the assay later. Later, she would learn the box held 23 pounds of dust and nuggets, which at the going rate came to a figure her Uncle Peter would never earn if he ran the trading post at Fort Vermilion for the next 50 years. Beneath the gold, on the floor of the box, an oilcloth packet, wrapped in beaver skin, tied with a leather cord. Her hands in the mittens shook when she took it out. She sat by the sled with the packet in her lap and undid the cord. Inside was a small green ledger book, Ferris Duffy's route log for the winter of 1888 to 1889. The last entry dated the third day of the January of '89 at Peace Point, with the weather noted as coming out of the northwest, and the ice ahead noted as untested past the elbow, and a single sealed letter, in a hand not quite steady, addressed to Adele Duffy at Winnipeg. She opened it in the cold. She had to. She could not carry it out of the pass unread and pretend she had not opened it. She read it. Ferris Duffy told his wife that he had promised for 40 winters that the next run was to be the last. He wrote that he had meant it every time. He wrote that meaning it every time, and going anyway, was what had made him a man he no longer recognized. He wrote that if this run took him, it was because the ice had grown tired of a man who kept coming back to it, after saying he would not. He wrote that Adele had known this about him. He wrote he was sorry. Then he wrote, in a smaller hand at the bottom of the page, and Rena would remember these lines, as she had remembered her father's last, the rest of her life, that a man who promises the last run for 40 winters is not, in the end, an iceman. He is a man who prefers ice to the room where his wife is waiting. He wrote that he understood that now. He wrote he would like Adele to know he understood it. He asked her to forgive him, if she could, and if not, to think of him kindly on the days she could bear to. Rena sat still. Skip put his head against her arm. She thought of her father coming in the door from the whiteout, sitting down on the boot bench, saying, "Mop tight," and slipping sideways. She thought of the number of times she had watched him leave for a run and come back and leave again. She thought of her mother watching him leave. She copied the letter into her own logbook, word for word, in pencil, because that was what her father would have done. She refolded Duffy's original and put it back in the oilcloth. She whispered Adele Duffy's name aloud. She did not know then whether the woman was living or dead. She would find out. She dug the sled out over the next 2 days. She uncovered Ferris Duffy under his half of the tarp and Osric Vale under the other, both of them intact in the cold, both of them with an expression on their frozen faces that was not fear, but a kind of quiet apology. She said the burial words her mother had said at her grandfather's grave. She marked the sled with a cross made of 2 pieces of the splintered oak deck and a piece of the yellow hemp tied in the Ostmark family knot. So anyone who came out on that ice again would know 2 things, that Ferris Duffy had been found and that an Ostmark had found him. She hauled the strongbox and the packet back to Fort Chipewyan on her hand sled in 3 days. Skip walked all 3. She stopped at the last low ridge before Fort Chippewyan and looked back at the ice and said aloud, "Thank you." She did not know exactly what she was thanking. The ice, her grandfather, her father, all of them, perhaps only Ferris Duffy. Klaus Ekberg opened the door and looked at her, and looked at the sled and did not need to be told anything. He took the strongbox inside. He looked at the packet. He read the letter. He read it a second time and set it down, and passed his big swollen hand across his eyes and said, in Swedish, a word Rena did not know but understood. They notified the HBC factor's office at Fort Chippewyan on the following morning. The factor's grandson, Baird McQuine, who had laughed at her, came out to Klaus's cabin without his hat on and stood at the door and stammered an apology and asked to see the sled. She let him come out with her the next week and see it. He did not laugh once. When they came back, he sent a telegram to Winnipeg himself and paid for it out of his own pocket to a woman he had located in an hour by asking the right man in the HBC office. Adele Duffy the younger, who was Ferris and Adele's granddaughter, who was 71 years old and lived in a small clean house in a St. Boniface neighborhood, and who had, all her life, known only that her grandfather Ferris Duffy had died on the ice and that her grandmother Adele had gone to her grave, never quite finished with him. Rena took the train to Winnipeg with the letter in the oilcloth in her coat pocket and Skip in a wicker basket at her feet. Adele Duffy, the younger, received her in a small clean parlor with a lace runner on the table and a photograph on the mantel of a stern man with a full beard whom Rena recognized at once as the man under the tarp. Rena put the packet down between them. She said, "This was your grandfather's. It was written to your grandmother." She never read it. I think perhaps you should. Adele Duffy the younger read the letter. She did not weep at first. She read it twice. Then she looked up at Rena and said, in a voice a little thick, "My grandmother said, until the day she died, that she did not know if he had ever meant to come home." Rena said, "He meant to. I think that is the worst of it." Adele Duffy the younger held Rena's hand across the table for a long minute and did not speak. They drank tea. Rena went back to Fort Vermilion by way of the Peace River town where the county clerk kept the trapline registries. She hired a lawyer, a young man Klaus had named, who worked out of a small office over a grocery. She showed him the paper Peter had put in front of her the day he told her to leave. She showed him her father's log, dated in his own hand every day of the illness, which proved that Ivar Ostmark had not held a pen on the day the transfer was supposedly signed. The lawyer took it from there. It did not require much. The transfer was struck. The trapline went back to Ivar's estate and, through it, to Rena as sole heir, because Peter was not, in law, an heir at all. Peter left Fort Vermilion within the year. Bernice went with him. Nobody in Fort Vermilion asked much about them after. Rena used the gold from the strongbox, sold clean, through the assay office at Edmonton, to buy back her father's cabin on the ridge above town, to fund a line tender's revival program with Klaus at Fort Chippewyan, and to pay Adele Duffy, the younger, a share of the value that Adele the younger did not want, and finally accepted as a scholarship in her grandmother's name at the St. Boniface School. Rena paid Klaus in cash and in trade credit, and in the promise to walk every mile of his old line with him once a winter, as long as he could walk it. He accepted. Skip is buried at the fence corner nearest the Peace, where he liked to sit with the wind in his ears. There is a rounded fieldstone over him with his name scratched in with an axe point. Rena trained apprentices in the Ostmark trade. She did not marry. She was asked, gently, and refused, gently. She kept the rope kit on the mantel and the coffee tin on the shelf and her father's logbook by her chair. Once a winter, she went out on the ice at the elbow and sat by the marker cross she had made for Ferris Duffy and Osric Vale, and did not say very much. Once a winter, that was enough. Some things you understand only when the cold does not scare you anymore. Rena understood, over the years, that Ferris Duffy had spent 40 winters carrying other men's gold across the ice, while telling his wife each time that the next was the last and had not been an iceman in the end. He had been a man who preferred the ice to the room where a woman was waiting. Her father had been a version of the same man. Her grandfather, too, in his way. The rope had held all of them up because the rope did not know what it was made for. That was the thing the rope taught her. The rope was honest. The men who tied it were not always. But the rope kept the line, and the line kept the memory, and the memory kept the letter. And the letter, at last, was delivered. The town at Fort Vermilion said, "The winter Rena Ostmark walked out onto the peace ice." That 70 winters was too many. The rope had another opinion. So, in the end, did the ice. If you have ever waited for someone to come home from a road that was never going to bring them back, drop a comment below and tell us what you were carrying the day you finally set the door down. I read them all. See you in the next one.